to Wild and Weird Radio, a Wild and Weird West Virginia podcast.
If you're listening on podcast, be sure to click the link below for the YouTube version of this episode to see the footage from several of the sites we discuss. Previously on Fallen Worlds, we examined the possibility that a massive impact event may be the root for the legends of over 1,200 cultures of a giant worldwide flood. And we examined the real evidence set forth that this event seems to have been caused by the so-called Younger Dryas impact event. The discovery of over 50 impact craters 600 miles across seems to suggest that the Earth was bombarded by multiple objects. Around the world, there are tales of fiery serpents descending from the sky, and multiple stories of strange visitors who gave warning to a select few who were to preserve themselves and their families in caves and on boats, who emerged eventually to restart the human race. It lasted for 1,200 years. For 48 generations, the human race fought against the elements, and when resources began to dwindle, they fought against each other. From this stress and desperation, they somehow managed to reemerge. Why does there seem to be a continuity between the stories from different cultures who could never have had contact with one another? Were these people warned by others who knew this event was going to occur? And what can we learn from these legends? Emily Uldrich, museum educator from the Southern Ohio Museum and Cultural Center in Portsmouth, Ohio, joins us in this episode to examine these legends from around the world and closer to home as we try to unravel the story of the survivors on this episode of Wild and Weird Radio.
Welcome back to Wild and Weird Radio, guys. We have a special episode queued up for you tonight where we are going to go into episode 3 of Fallen Worlds. Tonight, we've got Emily with us, and we're going to be digging deep into the story of the survivors, the people who made it through the aftermath, and how they might have carved out life afterwards. So this one's going to get wild and weird, guys. Emily, how are you doing? It's been so long since we've had a chance to talk. Last time we saw you was at Wild and Weird Con. How have you been?
I've been great. Yeah, thank you guys for having me. I'm even wearing my shirt that I picked up at
Oh, yeah, you got your Cryptid HQ shirt that you picked up there. That's awesome. We'll have to tag them in this, let them know that you're wearing a shirt.
HQ, yeah, that's
yeah,
awesome.
Please do. Yeah,
That's
I'm looking
great.
forward to next year.
Oh, it's going to be awesome. If you guys didn't know, we are having Emily back. She is our resident historian on all things old, ancient
History. Yes.
prehistory.
She is the one who keeps me in check.
Pretty much. It's not all aliens.
Sometimes
Or
it
is
is.
So tell us about what's behind you real quick, because you've got, like, I thought my studio was coming along really nice, but you really showed me up tonight.
So, yeah, my name's Emily Uldrich, and I'm the educator here at the Southern Ohio Museum and Cultural Center in Portsmouth, Ohio. So I'm actually sitting in the Art of the Ancients exhibit, which is a permanent exhibit we have here at the museum. So the museum has a collection of over 10,000 prehistoric Native American artifacts that were collected by a father and son. So here locally, it's known as the Wirtz Collection, and you can see behind me a case filled with effigy pipes.
And those FSG pipes, those are just absolutely gorgeous. I remember when Ron and I came down there, we actually got the opportunity to sit in on a lecture that was being given that day by complete accident. It was just
crazy.
It was perfect timing. Yeah. And I couldn't get away from that effigy pipe case because there's just so much beauty right there, and it's so old, and how accurate some of those depictions were. They're just absolutely astounding. Now, I know that you've listened in to the previous Fallen Worlds episodes we've put on here. And you know that last time we covered, just to give our listeners a quick catch up, we covered what could have happened with this global flood or global disaster scenario. We had all these mythologies and all of these religions that have all tangled up this flood or great world disaster. Over 12,000 different stories. And you can't just make that up across the entire globe without something actually happening. And we hypothesized that it could be tied to the Hiawatha crater because the timelines match up with 12,500 years ago, a massive crater that could have struck a gigantic miles deep, thick chunk of ice. This huge glacier cap that would have instantly melted, instantly vaporized, and instantly sent massive hurling chunks of ice thousands of miles away.
Well, we've got even more than that since we did that episode.
We have.
Digging back into it. And, you know, it's important that we talk about the time frame that we're talking about here, too, because when we go into a little bit later in the show, we're going to be talking about how that affected our area.
Yeah.
And Emily's going to really probably just blow us away on that. But how it actually started out was we're dealing with a time period, the Paleolithic area, right? So we're back there. I mean, we're really back there. We're talking about 12,000 years ago is when this thing hit. 10 to 12,000 years ago. That seems like, not that long ago, really, if you think about it. I mean, people have this concept that, these massive impacts and whatnot, they took out the dinosaurs 300 million years ago, but this happened in a relatively short span of time. And it also ends up with that magical number, 10,000 or so, which is about where, the sinking of Atlantis was thought to be. It's the same kind of thing. The same stories. These stories are passed down and over again. And I think that, as you said, how did the world, perceive this stuff, right? So there were some really good legends that were passed down that do seem to corroborate exactly what you said, that this was a worldwide catastrophic event. It was felt everywhere. It completely wiped out certain places. And what's crazy is for whatever reason, certain people were chosen to survive and ride these things out, whether it be in a boat, whether it be in caves, as with the Hopi, underground with the ant people, the reemergence, all of these cultures have the reemergence stories where they all came back, and some people remembered. And that was important because they were to remember and pass on, probably so that people wouldn't make the same mistakes. But,
And in many of these cultures, the way it was passed down was verbal tradition.
That's right.
Writing seemed to have been destroyed. These people that built shelters in one way, shape, or form to survive, you can't tell me that they didn't know how to write.
My friend, what it looked like to me from just looking at the data of this is, if you look back, the oldest Dryas was 17 to 13,000 BC. That's 20 to 16,000, something like that, years old, years ago, right? So, that's the oldest Dryas. So we were already coming out of something at that point, and it was getting warmer. And then all of a sudden, boom, 12,000 or so, that's when it dropped off again. And the temperature literally plunged in a matter of, just like 100 years or something. I mean, it was so fast. And it's the Ice Age. Yeah, it's the Ice Age again. I mean, it was warming up, and here's the Ice Age again. And we had these people that were trying to survive. And how does that fit into, I guess, the world culture at that point? We have to remember, metallurgy didn't start until around 5,000 BC. We're talking about something that happened, 6 to 7,000 years before that. So what happens is after this event, somehow people suddenly they skyrocket. Technology starts skyrocketing, and all of a sudden, here they are. And they say that they did that because they were helped. They were shown how or why, these things worked. I don't know, but I'm just going to tell you that all this proves to me, I don't know about you guys, but to me, that there were definitely, there was this massive catastrophe. Certain people did survive. And we need to look at those survivors to kind of understand the mechanics of this, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. I mean, there are so many people, like the Choctaw tell of the story when the earth was plunged into darkness for a long time. A bright light finally appears in the north. It was a mountain of high waves, like you said, Joe, which kind of indicates of this Younger Dryas event. It wasn't one big massive thing. Now they're thinking, what'd they find? 50 craters at this point. There are 600
50 craters that were assumed to be related to the single impact.
Yeah. So 600-mile wide craters, by the way, guys. These are massive craters, and they're all over the world. So this was a worldwide event. And here's the thing. They think it didn't just happen one time. This may have happened over a period of time. So as this big comet comes in, breaks up, and, we're in this stream, right?
Well, I just actually wasn't even doing research at the time for this episode, and I came across an article last week that mentioned that it was possible that what could have ended the Adena culture would have been another one of these events that took place.
Oh yeah, they ran a big article in the Washington Post about that.
Yeah, that's the one I was talking about. Did you get a chance to read that one?
I did. Yeah, they were saying that there were wooden palisades that were scorched, I think, really high temperatures.
Yep.
And that buried inside the earthworks, they found meteoric iron.
Oh, wow.
So it came from somewhere else.
And it wasn't just in the
Off
meteoric
planet.
iron. They found the chunks of meteoric iron, but they also, in the soil composition, there were like dust fragments, meteoric dust.
Microspherules.
Oh,
Yes.
interesting.
That's cool.
So in the dirt, in these mounds, are the microspherules that Ron was just mentioning, these small meteoric dust fragments. And you can actually detect those on a spectrograph when you're testing the soil.
Oh, that's wild.
And it was, when I saw that, I was like, oh man, this is crazy, because we were literally just having this conversation started over a year ago, almost 2 years ago now. And then here we are, we're finding out all of these theories that we had are actually being found in the real world. But what we were doing is, these weren't really our theories. We were applying the stories that were passed down verbally by these cultures and that hang around still today, that told of these serpents that streaked across the sky. And it sounds like a meteorite. If you think about that, you see this big bolide just erupt through our atmosphere. You'd have this tail, and then as it came into the atmosphere, it would break off into separate pieces, and it would look as if the serpent was multiplying and going out to spread across the sky. It was just as they said. Why is it that modern history has had such a difficult time accepting some of these ancient stories that were passed down? What do you think?
Because there's more to it. I mean, look at what you just said. What you just said is what I think too. I think that some of these snake, these serpent, the symbology, all that, it's symbolic. It's a mnemonic device. We should know what that means. Our ancestors did know what that means. When they saw a picture of the snake, they knew what that meant. That was a story. Don't you forget this. This means this. Well, somewhere along the line, they got so obsessed with material goods and everything else, they just forgot. And you know what's really funny? If you look at the Hopi legends and you look at what they say, that's why the world was destroyed, because they got away from the spiritual side, right? This is a constant reoccurring theme. You mentioned the snake, and I love that you did that, because, Quetzalcoatl. Some people call him Quetzalcoatl. How you pronounce it is Quetzalcoatl. So if you hear me say that, don't say, hey, you're saying it wrong. No, I'm not. Quetzalcoatl is this, it's an amazing thing, because here we have not only a possible representation of a comet, right? Of an event that people saw. Well, some think that Quetzalcoatl came with that. Like this was the ship, so to speak, or either he arrived when this came, because he was there and he gave people, horticulture. He gave them, the whole, all of it, the means to survive after this event happened. So These are amazing stories, and we can't just look at them and say, oh, those are just fanciful things when we're
I
hearing
think
it all around the world, guys.
so. I think a good leaping off point here, after talking about what happened there and the survivors, I think a good jumping off point for that would be the Clovis culture.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. Yeah, it's funny. I've been working on this book on the Portsmouth Earthworks. Gosh, it's been almost 2 years now, and I'm really putting on the final touches. And one of the things that I put off till the end was my timeline. So over the weekend, I was working on putting together a timeline. And what I'm doing in the book is linking some of the pottery from different areas that has been found in the Portsmouth Earthworks complex. And we've got pottery that is from the southeastern woodlands. So we're talking about like Tennessee and Alabama and Georgia area. And then we also have pottery that comes from the Southwest, which is something that hasn't been documented previously. And so I was doing a timeline for all of these areas. And it's interesting because once you hit the Archaic period, it's all very different. But when you go back to Clovis, everybody has Clovis points. And even a little bit later, when we're talking about 9,000 years ago to they think maybe 8,000 years ago, the Folsom culture, they all had this really similar projectile points, no matter where you're at in the whole country, in the whole continent.
No, that's true. That's absolutely true. And
So-
then something happened, right?
Yeah, something happened.
So this culture seemed to either disappear as if they were eradicated in some other catastrophic event, but in my opinion, and I think that we've all talked about this together loosely, is that they assimilated or absorbed into these other tribes and peoples. What do you see any kind of connection in the actual physical data with that, Emily?
Well, what I see is, yeah, once you hit, and then it's so hard for me too because the timeline is highly questionable, so
Right.
like it makes it difficult. But what they think happened around 8,000 years ago was this transition from the Paleo-Indian period to the Archaic period, and at this point in time, you see a proliferation in tool making, so different types of tools that they didn't have before, grooved axes and things like that, and then also the whole difference in their projectile points. So instead of having points that were lance shaped, they have points that were all different shapes, and they had notches in the base that helped them wrap them for attachment to either the atlatl dart or the spear shaft. And there's just so many different ones, and it gets interesting because some of the archaeologists try to say that each one of those is a different culture, and then some of them overlap, and then there's a lot of argument about it. But then it's hard too because like it's strange to me. What's more strange is that before they all made them the same way, because you know how hard it is to make something exactly like that, and then everybody gets their own ideas about how they want to do things. Maybe somebody wants to be different than the other people.
Exactly.
So you would think they would be more varied earlier on. So yeah, it is very strange. There is like a from night and day difference between Paleo-Indian cultures and what happened during the Archaic period.
Well, and part of that too, where you see that very similar construction of these napped out tools, especially like you were saying with the Clovis point, how it was all similar. Everybody, it was all almost identical, but then you started getting these different adaptations for attachment to atlatls, different styles of attachments. Do you think that it's a possibility, and this is just me speaking hypothetically,
Sure.
that part of the reason that these points would have all been made almost identically is that they could have been also part of the storytelling and even some kind of like religious set around the fire and tell stories, and we all nap the same way, we all make these points the same way because they represent a certain thing? So they didn't just have like a utilitarian purpose, but there was also a sacredness to it at the same time.
Yeah, that's certainly a possibility. I don't mean to trivialize it, but I remember being in preschool and they would write up on the board or like a drawing pad and they would tell you a story and they draw out a line. And then at the end of it, it would be a picture. Like they tell you a story about an alligator going over the mountains and the mountains would be the top of the alligator's back. So
Right.
I can see how something like that could be ceremonialized, and like the way that you napped out the flint, there's absolutely no reason why that could totally happen.
Because that was just one thing that I've always wondered, like why? Because they were all napped out. They were almost all identical, and you could almost look at them and see where they could almost look like they were all done by the same person, but we know that they weren't done by the same single guy that was just sitting there, unless he was just sitting there like constantly.
If you had to
Actually,
take an awful lot of points.
in
And spread
some
them around across the whole continent.
Right.
in some of those settings, though, in those actual gatherings, I won't call them tribes because we don't even know if they were tribes at that point, right? So they were
Yeah,
just
they were
gatherings.
more like gathering groups.
And that's kind of where the survivors
Cultural
start.
masses.
Yes, because that's what happened. These, a couple survivors got together and they hooked up with this other group, and pretty soon you have this massive gathering, and that's where the whole social culture started, really, kind of like that, right?
Yeah.
And so anyway, there would be specialists in those groups, and you're right, Joe. The best way to, I think, to keep something going, a technology going, is to teach it repeatedly like that. And we are dealing with the time, like you said, we didn't really write things down. It was verbal. So that's where you get a lot of these stories, a lot of the native stories. And to be, to be able to say this, as I've been told, storytelling, it was so important. I mean, word for word, it had to be, said word for word. That's how the storyteller worked. So I could definitely see a lesson where someone would sit there and and do as you said. But typically, yes, there was a good person, and he was in charge of making like the ceremonial points, from what I understand. Others, of course, made your own, like your hunters and whatnot. But for these ceremonial purposes, absolutely, what you said makes perfect sense to me. I mean, that fits right into what I've heard.
And again, that's just it's hypothetical.
Yep. Completely.
It's not anything that just kind of playing with ideas here.
Yeah.
So Emily, what are we looking at here? We know that we had the Adena culture here that seemingly almost just showed up. Did we have the same kind of phenomena out on the West Coast, or even in the Midwest?
So at that point when they were building, they think they were building the conical mounds. That was a phenomenon that showed up across the eastern woodlands. So we're talking from the East Coast all the way to the Mississippi River, like all the way up into Canada, all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. And then the mound building also extended to the west of the Mississippi River. So you actually did see mounds in Texas and Kansas and Oklahoma. And then there were even sites like in New Mexico where they had similar things to what we see here, where there were structures that were burned and then there was a mound built over the top of them. They had burial mounds out there. Now, I don't know if that went all the way to the West Coast or not, but it did extend up toward the Rocky Mountains.
Okay. So this is another hypothetical question here. Just because you mentioned the mound, specifically you said mound builders, and it reminded me of a question I've wanted to ask you for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about the idea that has floated around out there that the people that we call the Adena, and who eventually we define their culture as Hopewell and Fort Ancient, that they didn't build the mounds, that they just came up and found them, and that they were there and they used them as or viewed them in some culturally significant way and built their settlements around them?
I think that's certainly a possibility, but at one point in time, however far back that may be, somebody was making huge mounds with basket loads of dirt, and we found the baskets, and we know that the mounds were built in that way because the dirt lenses up like that. So at some point in time, so who knows if it was the people that they call Adena or the people that they call Hopewell, but they do know from the point those mounds were built, they were utilized, they were transformed by every single population that lived in the area after that. So like they continued to be added to be used, probably ceremonially or changed to fit their purposes in the landscape. So yeah, that's also, I mean, it's certainly a possibility.
Now, you mentioned the baskets that they were using. What kind of baskets were they? Were they like lattice style, or were they woven? Were they made of like, some kind of sweetgrass, or were they made from haze or grasses, or were they made from tree bark, or what kind of baskets were we looking at here?
So they were woven baskets, and they actually have found some of this organic material in the mounds, which is just amazing considering that they think they're at least 2,000 years old. For that to survive, and our climate here in Ohio and West Virginia, where it's so humid, is amazing. But yeah, they found them woven out of reeds. They found them woven out of tree bark. They've also found them woven out of twined fibers. So there's different plants that they think that they were made out of at that point in time.
Now, since they survived, like, do you think that they might have kind of like impregnated the material they were using with some kind of like animal fats to make them waterproof or preserve them a little bit?
Well, most of the preserved material was actually preserved because of its association with copper. So the copper salt is what actually preserves the woven fibers and also the fiber baskets. Gotcha. And then some of it they found excavated, like they could see it, but then as soon as they touched it or tried to move it, it just disintegrated. And then unfortunately, that was at a time when they weren't taking a lot of photographs. So like the only record we have, a lot of them are just illustrations and people's word of mouth.
And guys, just to give you all a heads up on how quick something like that can happen, and the fact that these baskets were preserved as long as they were is so remarkable. Where I worked last year at Kanawha State Forest, there was an old picnic area that we rediscovered that had only been grown up for about 15 years.
Oh, wow.
And we found the ghosts. We called them the ghosts of picnic tables, where the picnic tables just collapsed down onto the ground, but looked like a picnic table that was just flat built, laying on the ground.
Oh, that's amazing.
And you could just walk up to it with a broom and whew, there it goes. It's dust in the wind. So the fact that these entire picnic tables were able to break down that way and that fast, and just, now mind you, they were probably up there for 10 or 15 years themselves prior to being abandoned. And not being
still compared to thousands of years, that's
right.
Pretty. Yeah.
And being so just to give you guys an idea, those baskets were preserved in a mound, untouched for thousands of years, and there they were, just sitting, and still in their place. Like, that's just crazy, mind-boggling to me that they were preserved.
It is mind-blowing.
Now I am going to try to do a little screen share here again. Here we are. This is in Rock House, and this is in Ohio. That is a massive cave system, basically, is what this is. This whole area is just covered with caves, and you can see people have been here for just hundreds of years, okay? But what's really neat is not the hundreds of years, but when you go inside, you're going to see they've been here for a lot longer than hundreds of years. It's thousands of years. This is where a lot of people once lived. There's a good example. There's one of the little areas where it was cooked. You can see the charring back there. You can see this. So when they went into these areas, they actually found ash back in these. I don't know about the actual archaeological, what they actually found or anything. You can look into that, Emily, and, tell us more about that at some point. But this is a massive area, and you can see how many people could have fit in this. It is protected from the elements. There's some of these carvings I've never seen like that. Some of these carvings have been here for hundreds of years. There's carvings here from the 1800s. You'll see one here in a second. And there's one, 1880. So a lot of people also utilize these caves during, I guess, the Prohibition days and whatnot too. And robbers and murderers and whatnot hung out in here too. But look at this. Look at the wear on these rocks down here at the base. I mean, you can actually see where they're smooth. And that's a lot of climbing up and down to do that to that rock. You see it there.
Yeah.
So yeah, back up in here. This is all, this is all charred. There's up in, you can still see the black up on the actual ceilings where the fires were. So a lot of people were back in these areas at one time. You can just go right in here. This is, it's all been cleaned out. This is a big tourist area now, so I'm not hurting anything. But you can see the color. I was blind to Maria there. She wasn't too happy. But there you go. You can see it back in here.
Oh, it definitely looks burnt and charred.
You see that? You see it? Yeah. And these areas are just, it's amazing to just stand in there and look at that. I forget how big this one is. It's a couple of 100 feet, I think, something like that long. And you could just imagine the small groups of survivors, you know. And when I say survivors, I mean people who are surviving this ice age, regardless of what caused that ice age. We know there was one. So this would be a place where they would all gather and, and live. This would be a place of survival, basically. This would be normal life. There are places in here that are really cool. You'll see some here in a second. There are holes in the ground, and that's where water collects. So it actually collects in like these little cistern types, pools, and they literally would not have had to leave this except for just to go out and hunt and come back in. That was Rock House. Then the next one, and there's a little example. You see the little opening right here? These are everywhere, and if you crawl back in those, it is exactly what you saw back there. All these little openings, they're full of it. There's a good example of the darkening on the wall. You can see it up in there. I thought this was neat. There's the traditional spiral that we've come to see over the years in petroglyphs. And okay, that was Rock House. That was the history of Rock House. So let's just go forward and let's go to Ash, because this is the one. This is a massive, open-faced a cave, and it's basically this big amphitheater kind of area. These were all carved out during the Ice Age, and you can see these openings. Well, in these openings, you go back in there, and again, that was just some worms that were making spirals. I thought was neat, so I took a picture of it. But up here, there you go. See that? No one's been in here forever. More rocks with carvings. And that actually looks like it could be legit. But this is the place. This is Ash Cave. I don't know if you've heard of it or not, but Ash Cave was called that because when they found this place, there was ash in here, and it was in some piles. Well, the biggest pile was 100 foot by 30 foot wide by 3 foot deep. They theorized that back in here, this is where they had cooked for just, thousands of years, literally. This is another example of one of those sheltered areas, and you can see how big this place is. I mean, it's massive. You can see again, there's the charring right along the seam there. So these places are just massive, and as you're there, you're just like, wow, this is amazing to think that where you're standing, there's your good example of one of the areas where it was worked. So this was probably for grinding, I would think, something like that, possibly. I don't know, but that is just an amazing place. And here's the one I wanted you to see. I saw this up on the side, and I had to crawl in. So I crawled in here and wedged it between these rocks and touched nothing. And there you go. There it is. You can see it along the back wall. That is fresh ash on that wall. Don't know what's back in here. Couldn't tell you. Didn't go any further. But it was amazing just to sit right here at this opening and just, yeah, it was wild. I'll just tell you that, because you knew that the people who had been here before, they lived in there at some point. So that was, to me, one of the coolest places I think that I've been in a long time. Yeah, there's a natural water source there. I mean, this is the ideal survival place. So just a really cool place, and it was really cool. My point being, when I saw that, was I think that's when I said, well, we got to do the story on the survivors. Because, I never really thought it could be that close to home.
And where was that, Ron? Is that Hocking Hills?
Yes, that is Hocking Hills. That whole area, from what I understand, is just pocked full of these. And I don't know if that's true or not. I mean, I really do think that there's something there that just... It's a piece. There's a missing piece. We don't hear about this here in North America as much. We hear about it everywhere else. We hear about these cities and these places where people lived and restarted stuff all around the world. Darren Kuyu, all these places, right? But we don't hear about it here. It's very, very rare that we hear it in around our actual tri-state area.
So they have a specific, what they call habitation site that they call shelter houses. And so those are places like Ash Cave, and they have found obviously evidence of habitation when they dig down into the silt and the sand that's underneath.
Wow, it's just amazing. I mean, to think of how many years that if there was an ash pile there and it was 100 foot long by 30 foot wide by 3 feet deep, can you imagine how many fires that was?
It's a lot.
Or how big the structure was that burned.
That's possible too.
Mhm.
I mean, we are dealing with the land of the Shawnee, so.
Yeah, and you're looking at something that would fit the dimensions of like a, almost like a longhouse at that
like a
point.
longhouse, yeah, or ceremonial,
or some kind of
house.
ceremonial structure,
Mhm,
and then you just torch it, like as the end of
the ceremony.
the ceremony or the time you're spending there. And so, I mean, that could very well have been the remains of a structure as well, depending on how straight down the shape was.
There was a lot of theories. They actually thought. I think some of the settlers at first thought that the natives in the area had did some kind of smelting program, which was, I don't know. I have no clue. And they thought that gunpowder was made in the area. There was just all these weird theories, and but I think that it could be something to do with the fires, because the documentation is still there to this day. Those walls are still black, and that's just amazing.
There are people that think that they were smelting metal here. So now, largely, like the conventional archaeology says that that didn't happen, that they cold hammered, but then they have done studies where they found that it was at least heated, maybe not to the point where it melted, but was heated. But then there is a whole other camp of people that think that prehistoric people were here and they were actually smelting and casting metal, and they have found evidence of fire pits in different places where they think it could have gotten hot enough in order for them to do that.
Wow, that is, I mean, I wouldn't put it by them. Let's put it this way, especially if there was a pre-existing technology at some point. A handful of people probably did remember how to do it. Who's to say that's not what they found, and then everyone else just simply forgot. But
or that they were attempts to try to do it but couldn't replicate the temperatures needed.
Exactly. Like, well, we heard this worked. Oh, well, we don't know how to do it. The technology's, it's gone. The knowledge is gone. But I do know that I find it very interesting, based on what you had just said about the possible smelting aspect of the whole thing. I remember hearing tales of some really big artifacts found. They were like some kind of they were metal. They were like a form of copper, but they were different from what I remember hearing. I don't know how. This was a long time ago.
Found copper axes, like almost 2 feet long,
Yes.
weighing over 30 pounds, like multiple times in the mounds. Now, I mean, you could have spent a lot of time hammering sheet copper to make something like that. And like, I don't know, I imagine they could probably study it. But the hard part is too, a lot of these are in museum collections. And I know from working here at the Southern Ohio Museum that museums are all about preserving objects. Like, we can speculate all day about how these people lived or how old things are, but the objects themselves are really the only evidence we have, especially since they didn't have writing. And so it's really difficult to justify destroying an object in order to learn more about it.
Right.
Oh, I have to agree with that. Yeah. A lot of people are like, oh, well, and I want you to touch on this too, Emily, because I'm one of those people, and I think you agree with me. We're no fan of radiocarbon dating as a absolute answer to stuff, are we?
Yeah, I consider that an estimate. And I mean, it really is an estimate. So yeah, I actually did a lot of research into radiocarbon dating, and then they also have another form of direct dating that they use now for objects that were heated, like pottery, or sometimes they heat treated flint before they flaked it.
Yep.
And so they use what they call thermoluminescence dating to date those objects. But both radiocarbon dating and thermoluminescence dating require the destruction of a certain portion of that object. And then beyond beyond that, you're right, it's an estimate. So in radiocarbon dating, they calibrate it and they tell you that the calibration curve, so like the amount of that isotope of carbon that was in the atmosphere during those different times went up and down. And so like there would be peaks where it's the same level, and those could be many thousands of years apart. And so they just kind of have to guess where we're at within that timeline. And then for thermoluminescence dating, they're really supposed to be taking readings in the ground. So there's also radioactive rocks in the ground.
Yeah.
And so like if you happen to have your piece of pottery next to that, it's going to influence the date, the age that it comes out of when you use that process. And then on top of that, they're supposed to measure water content of the soil, because the water content affects it, not just for thermoluminescence dating, but also for radiocarbon dating. They've done studies in Africa where it takes as little as 40 years for the moisture in the soil to mess up the radiocarbon dating. So yeah, and then you're talking about how many thousands of years until we get back to the Paleo-Indian and the Younger Dryas. Like there's a lot of time when the moisture level could fluctuate from really dry to really moist, and all of that messes up the dating system.
Yeah, and there was one I'd seen where it said solar flares, solar radiation could also throw it off immensely.
Oh, certainly.
So yes, guys,
And
that
then-
would be why I have the issue with.
And then on top of that, you can't radiocarbon date anything made of cannel coal, can we?
No, nothing made of stone. So yeah, that doesn't really work. And then archaeologists, of course, rely on stratigraphy. And the whole assumption in stratigraphy is that whatever layer of dirt, and then there's another layer of dirt. So the top layer of dirt, no matter if it's been jumbled, is always younger than the lower layer of dirt. Which, okay, that works okay, I guess, if you're in a place that's not disturbed. But like we and a lot of the prehistoric sites that are around us are in the river valleys. So like the river could erode something upstream and take a spear point that's from the archaic period, and they could go and deposit it somewhere else over the top of something that is from the late prehistoric period in the Fort Ancient culture, and it would look like the Fort Ancient points were older than the archaic points. And then don't get me started on diagnostic artifacts and fossils. So yeah, the whole thing is very
we've gone down that road before.
Yeah.
And
you're right though. I mean, yeah.
And then not just that, but we had mentioned that these, specifically speaking about the mounds, that the mounds were also borrowed and that they were repurposed, and that other tribes, not even people that would pass through that were not utilizing the mounds, but they would come by the mounds knowing that they were a sacred place, and they would leave a gift, and they would bury the gift in the mound as a sign.
Yeah, we do find a lot of caches in the mounds, where people leave objects. Yeah, you're totally right. Well, and intrusive burials too. So they know that people later, like they would build up the mound in layers and bury people, but then at a certain point they decided that it was too much work, I guess, to put in all those basket loads of dirt. So they just dig a hole into the mound and bury people. And so yeah, that went on for many thousands of years.
And not just that kind of intrusive burial, but if you come down here to South Charleston, West Virginia, there's 2 mounds in South Charleston that are still standing. One of them is in a cemetery. And there's 3 graves in the top of the mound that are modern graves that were, just the locals who were living here at the time just said, well, we'll chuck somebody in the dirt up there on top and, use it because that was part of the family land. But yeah, I mean, so you have those kind of burials that were taking place in some of these as well. So it makes the calculation of that stuff very difficult. So,
yeah.
But getting back to the survivors, what kind of world, like we're dealing with this catastrophic restart, so to speak. We've got the stories from the Hopi where they emerged from the ground. We have these stories of that were passed down from tribes that talked about the southern migration north and how their peoples came up into this land, and that there were seemingly people here before them. What kind of world would we been looking at that point in time, based off what we have that we know?
Well, we do know that the Ice Age extended pretty far, not down here to southern Ohio or West Virginia, but the glaciers covered most of Ohio and a lot of the northern states. And then you have to look at Ice Age mammals like mastodon and woolly mammoth, all the way down in Clovis and Folsom, New Mexico. So that's
Yep.
pretty far south for an animal that supposedly has a huge winter coat to be able to live. And then there were an awful lot of them also. So we know that they were there for an extended period of time. So the climate must have been a lot different now. I don't think they would have been able to survive out in the desert at this point in time.
Right, and it was. I think there was also the giant ground sloth, which is like our state fossil. We had those here, and they extended all the way into Mesoamerica. So they recently found like a cave that had a bunch of mammoth bones in it, but then that was down in Central America, and then in that jumble of mammoth bones, they were also finding giant ground sloth bones as well.
Wow. So yeah, you're talking about near the equator, it being cold enough for these animals to be able to survive. But then it's so weird too, because they're finding the skeletons and almost totally intact mammoths in the permafrost where it melts. So like they were apparently living really far north too.
Right.
So yeah, I guess I mean when you're talking about the retreat and then the ice age coming back on over and over again, like that would be something that could explain those occurrences.
So obviously we're looking at this landscape here in our region that we're in, which is the southern Ohio, central and eastern West Virginia. We look around the mountains, we see all these glacial deposit rocks where you have these massive boulders that are sometimes the size of a house, and they are stacked on top of one another on top of mountains. And so you're looking at something that the ice would have been at least that high.
Well, that and then the water. So some of these they think were carried down in the water, and then we share a lot of this geology. So I'm really excited because here at the Southern Ohio Museum of Cultural Center, we're hosting a series of prehistory lectures that is going to range from the spring all the way through the fall. So the first one is going to be on April 28th. It's a Thursday at 6 o'clock here in the museum at the Hopkins Theater. Seats about 100 people. So we're really excited to kick it off. Dr. Kurt Shoemaker, who is a professor of geology at Shawnee State University, is going to come, and he's going to tell us what the area was like 750,000 BC. So they think at that certain point in time, there was that big lake, Lake Tite, which was the glacial lake that covered like almost everything but the tallest hilltops, probably not quite the mountains in West Virginia, but where we're at, pretty close to the top of the hills. And then at some point in time, when the glaciers retreated, that lake all drained. And then the Taze River Valley, there's evidence of that river just to the west of where I'm at. And yeah, I know
it's funny you bring that up because I actually live in the Taze Valley.
Oh, nice.
That's actually the name of the area right here. And you can see when you're in the Taze Valley, you can actually see where the ancient riverbanks would have set.
Oh, wow.
Because the way the mountains are just carved out. And it's really interesting. Like you can look at the map of the old ancient Taze River and see like, oh yeah, I know exactly where this mountain ridge is because you can still see it now. And that's where there was like little islands and pockets and where the river would deviate and go around certain high points. So it's really neat living in one of these areas like that.
But yeah, you can imagine if a boulder got trapped in ice and then got floated down the river or the lake, like how these things could have gotten transported even past the point where the glaciers were.
Or even launched. If there was some kind of cataclysmic impact, you're talking about not just ice, but debris that's earth that will be just chucked through the air. So I mean, there's chances that some of that would have been displaced that way as well. So we've got these cultures that are seemingly just starting back up.
Yeah.
Because we have places like Gobekli Tepe that predate
all of
these massive catastrophes.
Mm-hmm.
And they show signs of stoneworking and they show signs of culture, and not just with meeting and gathering with religious ceremony, but also in ways of manuscript that we don't quite understand, using glyphs and archaic pictures to try to communicate ideas. And then we have this cataclysmic event take place, and now we're setting in an era where the survivors are here. You know, they're
yeah.
trying to make do with what they have.
Yeah, exactly. And you brought up Gobekli Tepe, and that's a great place because, you know, some believe that Gobekli Tepe was built for that reason. That those were some of the people who survived, who would go in there and start, you know, to try to, I guess, build something that says, you know, this happened,
Yeah.
and you should remember. And it kind of seems like that happened everywhere. We know that our ancestors were very obsessed with the sky. They were very obsessed with the stars, and people thought for years, you know, for the archaeoastronomy, they thought that this was ceremonial. What if it wasn't ceremonial? What if this was, you know, passed down to them, not as so much of a ceremony as in spiritual or religion, but as in just a way to remember. Don't forget this. You know, make this part of your ritual so that you don't forget this. This happened. There was a time when this thing came from the sky. Don't forget this. This could happen again. We were told it happened before. Who knows? It could be the same thing, you see. We know that they were preoccupied with this. They watched the stars. They watched the stars for hundreds and hundreds of years. Gobekli Tepe was a great example of what you just said. From what I remember, it operated pretty much for 8,000 years, and it was lined with a specific star group, and then it was tore down, and then it was rebuilt, and this time it was aligned with another star group, and every time it was rebuilt, it degraded, as in the people who knew how to make that first one, they lost the technology, or they started to lose the technology to figure out how to make it as pretty and, you know, smooth as it was before,
and it seemingly became more and more archaic.
Yes, absolutely.
So
and
it goes almost in reverse as to what you'd almost expect. Because you would expect the technology to increase and get better, and the skill work, the handymanship, the craft behind the actions being done, especially for such a sacred site.
That's right, Joe. But here's the problem:
to get better and better and better, but it didn't.
You know why it didn't, though? This is just speculation. In my opinion, why it didn't was because in the beginning they had something. Those people had something that gave them the upper hand advantage. And then they lost that something, whatever it was. They didn't have it anymore. You know, it was a knowledge or technology, whatever. It wasn't there anymore. And they were trying to emulate this with best that they could, like you said. And then we see that fall down into, you know, hand pecking stones.
Well, I mean,
trying to get the shapes.
For a good modern analogy, it would be that if everyone who is currently, we'll just say like 25 and over, just died all at once. Something happened and we all died. The lights go out.
Yep.
Analog technology is a thing of the past. Analog technology, you can almost teach a monkey how to use it. Everything's been converted to digital. If you don't know the programming, if you don't know the code, if you don't know the language of the code, say if you know how to code, but it's not coded in the language that you know how to code, you're up the creek. You know, you've got to find a new way to make this thing work. That's the only thing that I can wrap my head around to make sense of what happened with Gobekli Tepe, which is how you start off with this base layer that is just beautifully carved animals and different creatures and symbols. And then it increasingly gets worse and worse and worse the higher up you go. And it's as if, like, you know, the skill set's gone, regardless of whether you think it's technology or some sort of science that they had or a particular set of tools. It's gone. The craftsmanship is gone. The people who had that trade either died off, and the people who were coming up never learned the trade because they were like, oh, we're not going to need that because they're always going to be around to take care of it. Kind of like how modern day society works.
Well, it's so funny because that really does mirror what happened here in Ohio and Kentucky and West Virginia during the woodland period and the late prehistoric period, because the first archaeologists that didn't have radiocarbon dating and the best they had to work with was tree ring dating. They thought that the Fort Ancient culture, who the archaeologists now think was from the late prehistoric period, 81,000 and later, predated the Hopewell culture and the Adena culture because their artifacts were more crude. And then the Hopewell culture was supposed to be the newer culture because it evolved from this, like, maybe not as nice, and then they got better at their artwork, and then it was like the pinnacle there was the Hopewell culture, and now they think the complete opposite. So at some point in time, somebody decided they weren't going to put as much time and effort into making these effigy pipes. So you find the ones in the Fort Ancient period or the Fort Ancient culture, and they're typically a little bit more crude, not as well defined, not as naturalistic as those made by the previous Hopewell culture. So it's kind of the same thing. But if you think about, like, even in more modern history, if you can lose the art of concrete for 2,000 years since the fall of Rome, I mean, you can lose anything.
Yep.
That is a great example. A cultural dark age. Yeah, that's exactly what we were describing too. And it seems that these do happen, that this technology does disappear. And it's almost like it is it's refound, it's rediscovered. Well, it seems that it's rediscovered because we always have these stories that someone remembered. Someone who visited and said, hey, here's this. You know, we go down into South America, we hear Viracocha. Viracocha did that. Viracocha shows up on the shore. It's very interesting because a lot of these so-called, they called them gods, of course, Maybe they were, I don't know. But whatever they were, they show up and they're almost always associated with water, first of all. The Oannes, that's another good example. Babylonian, Sumerian, the fish people, the half fish people. This is where we get our legends for, mermaids and mermen and all that, It means that they came from the sea. It's a symbolic thing again, but it was taken literal by the people who came later, who just heard the stories and said, oh, okay, they came out of the ocean. They had to be fish, so let's draw them like this. But that's my opinion anyway. But we do know that they're said that these people brought culture. These people brought, how to plant, how to domesticate animals,
needed skill sets for culture and for society.
And survival. Yes, and then eventually, like you said, whole society, laws, and then they just simply disappeared. Gone. And we see this in culture after culture after culture. There's always this a hero or some sort, right? I think it was in China. The whole thing of China was founded by one survivor, by the way, him and his family. They were told to do this thing, and they did it. And by the way, that thing was survive a flood. Another one of those flood myths.
Right.
Let's just stop calling them myths at this point. One of those flood legends, because this happened. There was something that happened. Whether you believe it was a worldwide flood, it doesn't matter to me. I think it could have been a worldwide flood on multiple levels. That's the way that I kind of see it. And where we don't hear flood, we hear people saying, well, the sun came down to earth.
Yeah.
And it burned the land. This is also, by the way, very relevant because if you do have a massive impact event, you both know this.
You're going to have a scorch ring. You're going to have an area that is destroyed by fire, and then the rest is going to be disrupted with typhoons and tsunami and crazy storms that are caused by upper atmospheric disturbance.
I even heard one that said that they were told to go underground because of something, and they kind of theorized that this impact could have actually affected the ionosphere to enough to where it would have affected radiation.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So there's something else about our whole thing about radiocarbon dating. Maybe that's why it's off so much in some places.
Yeah, it is an assumption that it's been relatively stable. So yeah, that's another one of those assumptions. Well, and I wonder too about the ice cores, because that goes back really far.
Yes.
But then
Yeah.
I think the same thing could happen that happens in a river setting. So, like, say you've got pollen that they think is from like the Ice Age period, but then it
Right.
melts and it gets transported down the glacier and then deposited on top of something younger, and it refreezes again. And then you do an ice core, like you're jumbling everything all up.
Well, even you've
That's
seen how
great.
glaciers move as well.
Mm-hmm.
Once they melt so much, they actually flip. And then what
Mhm.
happens when they refreeze? If they go back and their trajectory changes and they go back towards the parent glacier, and then they reassimilate. Now all the history is flipped upside down.
Yeah, that makes
Mhm.
a lot of sense. I always wonder too, they say what the seafloor spreads 10 centimeters or millimeters, I don't know how long it is,
Yeah.
but like that adds up if you're talking about this amount of time. So like
does.
wherever you are now does not necessarily mean that's where this piece of land was like however many
Mhm.
years ago.
You know, you're looking at the Pangea and the split up of continents and the slow migration of continents moving away from one another at that point. And that the tectonic activity that continues and all of the stuff that were like these warning signs to these previous cultures that there was something coming that was going to be bad. You know, there's ways that, you know, we're now measuring things like the Yellowstone caldera, for example. You know, we're babysitting that thing and just crossing our fingers and hoping that there's a way that we can release pressure before this thing goes pop.
Yeah, it doesn't
And
look like there's a whole lot that can be done to prevent something
No.
like that, unfortunately.
no, and you know, one of the better ideas I've seen was this use of technology to go and drill in and make a hydroelectric energy plant using and diverting a stream and a river there to create steam, and using relieving pressure and allowing magma to come up and create the steam, and then just, you know, break it up, ship it out, break it up, ship it out kind of deal. But
That seems desperate and hopeless, but okay.
it does, right? But I mean, it's better than just exploding, because I mean, you're talking the entire Midwest is just going to go pop.
Oh yeah, yeah. That's a super
But
volcano for those who don't know.
but you
And
know, you're looking at
yeah.
an event like that, for example. You know, it doesn't take a massive astrological event to make a tremendous climactic level of destruction that just is cataclysmic and earth killing.
Yeah.
You know, it can be a super volcano that can just jolt us into the next ice age completely unprepared.
Well, there are some who believe that that has happened before in the past as well.
Well, yeah, I
So
mean, we don't really have much of an option but to believe that there's certain
Mhm.
island chains that are
Yeah.
that are in fact the rim of an old caldera that went pop and just blew everything to hell. I mean, for lack of a
Literally.
better term,
Yeah.
like it just blew everything to hell, and there it all went, and that would have caused, again, that would be another ice age extender at that point in history.
Mhm.
So, you know, there's so many
Yeah.
of these events that take place that these cultures would have to survive and find ways to survive. And you see these drastic differences and changes after these survival points.
Yes, and it's what you're saying. It's the same thing. You know, were these people who showed up on the shores to help? You know, after this, had they already gone through something like this? You know, those are things that you have to wonder about, don't you? It's like, you know, is that how they knew? You know, the ones who say, you know, that well, Atlantis, Mu, those ancient, you know, legends of the ancient cities that existed far beyond time, you know, and the technology that they could have had. They all disappeared just like that as well. So, you know, is that what we're dealing with? Are we dealing with something to that nature? Is that who these survivors were? You know, we talked about the giants before, you know, that whole thing too, right?
Yeah.
No one says it was just, you know, the humans who survived. You know, if we established that there were something here before, some kind of a hybrid race that,
Or something big.
or something, yeah, or something big that may still be back there. Who knows? You know, either way, there could have been something to that, is what I'm getting at. You know, it doesn't necessarily have to mean that we're talking about just the known. Did you freeze, Joe?
Nope.
That's terrifying. I hope it records like this. Can you see that, Emily?
He was very still for a moment.
Yeah. I'm good at just kind of getting static and just kind of hanging out there.
I'm not really sure what I'm seeing. You're all pixelated like you're in some witness protection program. But
Now all we got to do is change my voice.
I can do that. I will do that. But yes, it was very interesting just because, we do have the stories of like Easter Island. I remember when the first expeditions were talking about, they came across the island and
Yeah.
there were giants on the island. They were there. Like they saw them. And yet when we came back, they were gone. So
and so
who
were all
knows?
the trees.
Yeah, which is very strange in its own right because the theory was for years that they used those trees to roll the moai and all that, but then it was shown that those were palm trees and they would crush into pulp if you put a multi-ton statue on top of them. But who knows? I like the old legend that says they were simply moved there by some magical means. So,
Are you guys familiar with Wally Wallington?
I know that name.
So Wally Wallington, I don't know what happened to him. It's a big mystery also. But Wally Wallington, I think he was from Michigan, but you can look him up on YouTube. He was this guy that was making his own Stonehenge in the backyard by himself.
Yes, that's
and
who
he was using like fulcrum points and like spinning huge rocks on a tiny stone and using like sand and just like wood, like basic things that people could have used during prehistoric time. And he was moving these huge blocks all by himself. He moved his son-in-law's barn like by himself. Like it's just crazy. Like yeah. But that's the kind of thing that's like lost technology. And then like we've lost Wally. I don't know what happened to him. And so like the ideas that he had, his website's scrubbed from the internet. Like I don't know.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a big conspiracy theory that surrounds him. Like he would be a fun one to actually do a future episode on, because like you said, there's so many, there's video records of this guy doing stuff and moving things in ways that you're like, oh, like moving these 2-ton blocks with one hand over these like wood rippled. He took these logs and he was cutting them in like quarters. So like the way you'd cut a potato, if you're trying to make a potato square, you cut the round edges off. Well, he was taking the rounded edges and putting them together like this to where they'd like make these little mound shapes, right? And then could take a multi-ton cut block and just push it really easy. And it just whoop,
wow.
all the way down. It was wild how this thing worked. And then he'd walk, and he could do it with one hand. He's just like pushing it with one hand, and then he'd walk down to it and like catch it and then push it the other direction and just start going going. It's just insane the way that these stones were able to be maneuvered.
Well, we look at the guy, Coral Castle down in Florida,
he's another
right? Edward Lee, whatever his name, Lilinski.
And he's just as mysterious as Wally Wallington.
And he said, I have figured out the way that they built the pyramids. That is his claim. And no one ever saw.
And then the men in black showed up and shoved him in a car and he disappeared.
Probably, yeah. It wouldn't surprise me.
You heard it on Wild and Weird like 11,000th. But yeah, so we've talked a little bit all over the place regarding the survivors and how they would have had to try to make it and carve it out this new existence here, it's particularly in our region. Is there anything that you would want to add? Because we are coming up against a time wall here. We got about 10 minutes or so left. So is there anything, Emily, that you would want to add to this that or some theories that you play with yourself? Some stuff that you've come along in your studies and seen how these people kind of hewn out their life here that you could add to the conversation real quick, just as a final thoughts.
Well, I think as far as the speculation goes, where you're talking about the survivors, like the timeline makes a little bit more sense to think that maybe that was something that happened post Clovis or post Folsom, because there it seemed like there was like everyone kind of had the same thing going on. They were using the same technology, they were using the same techniques, the same styles, but then all of a sudden you had this proliferation of different tools, different styles, different techniques, different cultures, they think. So that could have been something that happened post whatever catastrophic event went on at that point in time, whatever point in time that was.
Yeah, that's kind of what I've thought too. Is that it was the Clovis people were the people that basically were dispersed. That they were the ones that had to go into survival mode to make it through this new event, and that eventually they assimilated and broke into these fragmented groups and moved across the United States, possibly in a way to try to find habitable land again,
Mm-hmm.
to find
Yes.
suitable habitation zones where you had a climate that would grow, your crops that you were trying to get to grow. Mushrooms were in abundance, berries and natural sugars would be in abundance, and that would land you right here in Appalachia, which is one of the most fertile zones in the United States. It's just so hard to farm because guess what? It ain't flat.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not flat. And, and the hills, like you said,
Yeah.
Emily. And, the funny thing is, those hills may be what saved all those people.
It could have been
in
what
some
protected
way.
them very well. You're exactly right. Like there's so many maps, Ron, that exist out there. In particular, some of the ones that I've seen that involve like, nuclear strike maps and such, where West Virginia is like right in the what I consider the Goldilocks zone of all things that could destroy everything. So from nuclear maps to these some of the maps that are put out there that regard climate change and global warming, where the seas are rising, it's almost like you can see the eastern border of West Virginia just kind of chiseled out there because of the mountain range, and that would stop the ocean from moving forward. And it's on that. Then it's on we're actually this region, our part of Ohio and West Virginia, Kentucky, and Virginia, Tennessee are all like, again, in that Goldilocks zone when the caldera pops. We'll just be affected by dark skies and cold weather. We're not going to actually experience any of the nasty side effects, I guess you would call them, of an immediate eruption. We're outside of the heat zone because the mountains deflect it and shoot it back towards the caldera and vertically. And we're also protected in a way from any kind of land slurries and mudslides, again, because those mountains absorb that impact for us. So it's one of those things where when you're looking at it, like Ron had mentioned, these mountains could have been where some of those cultures, possibly even the Clovis people that were migrating throughout the United States, could have just been here and got lucky enough to survive this cataclysmic event.
Or found it, made a beeline for it, and was like,
they knew it was here. They knew it was here because people had traveled this route on expeditions for hunting,
Mm-hmm.
and gathering and trading. And here they are. They're like, hey, this place is actually like, it's well protected. It's got this. We need to go up there. That's going to be our best chance for survival.
Well, it's like you said, the caldera, the whole thing, make no mistake about it. If that goes, that is the end of your world. Regardless, okay, it doesn't mean just because you survive, it doesn't mean
you have to have a very specific skill set to continue surviving.
And these people did.
Yeah.
And if they didn't, we wouldn't be here. I think that's the most important thing that we can take away from all of this, regardless of how they got there, whether it was a asteroid, a comet, aliens. I don't know. It doesn't matter. The point is, something happened that reset humanity, or seems to have reset humanity. There was a bottleneck event where we dwindled down from, a lot of people to a very small amount and had to restart. And that is a matter of archaeological record. You can look that up.
Yeah.
And it's there. You can speculate. We can speculate forever on what happened, but something happened, and it's cyclical, or at least it seems to be. And it seems like when these cyclical things happen, it's important that someone tries to remember and warn the next generation, and so forth and so on. Does it make a difference? Probably not. But, hopefully some of us can remember and pass it on to the, what's the Hopi call it? The fifth world, right?
The fifth world. That's what the
fifth
Hopi.
World.
Yeah.
That's right. And that's the whole point of the whole thing. I think we're supposed to try to understand these things, Will we ever get the answer? Probably not. I don't think so. I think Emily's got it right. I think Earth changes, all these things that
Yep.
occur, these natural upheavals and these unnatural upheavals, it buries stuff, it jumbles stuff. You know, archaeologists, I love archaeology. I wanted to be an archaeologist when I was growing up. I actually conducted archaeological expeditions in my field beside my house because there were a
That's
few.
great.
Yeah, it was great. I had the whole area marked off. I got a book on archaeology. I was a geek. But the point is, you know, you learn really quick that just because, and what got me was when you read the books, it's like how many of these archaeologists are infighting with each other over dates and they're never going to agree. They will never agree. It is exactly like cryptozoology.
It
And the
is.
timeline will never be finalized. Yeah, you can guarantee that.
Yeah, I agree. It's what I've come to learn.
So, Emily, tell us on the way out here. Tell us about the museum and some of the stuff that you guys have going on there on the day to day, and where people can actually come meet you in person to see these amazing artifacts. And folks who've heard
Great.
the podcast before and listened, where we've talked about some of the stuff that was found in these mounds, and we think that this could possibly be a Sasquatch effigy, and we've had it looked at by some folks. And Emily, when we get off here, I want to tell you about them.
Great. I mean,
Is he back there?
They-
He's back there.
there
There he
is-
is.
Where Emily is sitting is the home of the real one of these. And you can go take a look at it there, and she can tell you the history of it and the history of all the other artifacts in that room, because they're absolutely amazing. So go ahead and tell them where they can find you.
So yes, we're at the Southern Ohio Museum and Cultural Center in Portsmouth, Ohio, and this museum is really special because all of our galleries are always admission free. So you don't have to pay to come in and look at this stuff. And then the other special thing about this gallery is the stipulation of the gift is that all 10,000 Native American prehistoric objects have to be on display for the public at all times. So this doesn't get changed around. We don't put things in storage. Every piece is on display and you can come and see it. So it actually is the largest collection in the entire region that is all on display. So yeah, it's spectacular. I can't say enough amazing things about it. Like, we continue to learn about it and do research on the collection, and it's just amazing what's already been revealed, and it's going to be even more amazing what is found out in the future.
Well, Emily, thanks for joining us, and we can't wait to have you back at Wild and Weird Con 2022. The conversation is just going to continue to get better.
You think your book will be out by then?
I sure hope so. Yeah, my goal was actually to have it out by March, but man, I've never done this before, so it's taken a little longer than I thought it was going to. But yeah, it'll be really great once it's finished. So yeah, all about this collection and the Portsmouth Earthworks Complex, which is, I've done research at this point, it's the largest earthen mound complex in the entire world right here. Yeah.
I want to go into, I want to have you back on the next time. We wanted to touch a little bit on it this time, but it would not have been fair just to go over it for 10 minutes. I want to go over a really deep detail on the Serpent Mound.
Yep.
Oh yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, because your knowledge on Serpent Mound is beyond anybody that we've ever spoke with. And your willingness to talk about it goes beyond even some of the academics that we've spoke with about it.
And then I will actually be speaking at the Friends of Serpent Mound Solstice celebration this summer also. So you can look for that in June, right next door to Serpent Mound.
We're actually going to do our absolute best to make it to that event.
Yeah, it's really fun. And I'm looking forward to Wild and Weird Con 2022 also.
Yeah, it's going to be a blast. Well, guys, you know where to find us. We would appreciate a like, share, and subscribe from all of our locations. Head on over to Helmet Holler. I have on good authority that there's going to be some amazing content coming in the future for you. She's been teasing it. As you noticed, Jess isn't with us. She's still out on assignment. She's been teasing some of the stuff. Wow, are you guys in store for something big? Then head on over, while you're on YouTube, go over to Wild and Weird West Virginia. That's where you're going to be the home of Wild and Weird Radio on YouTube. Then you can catch us anywhere where podcasts are caught. Any app that plays podcasts, you can find us. And if we're not on it, shoot us a message. We'll make sure we get listed. If you're listening on iTunes, go ahead and please leave us a 5-star rating and then drop us a little review. You can even make it a hate review if you want. Just leave 5 stars. Then, if you don't, just remember that there might be a future civilization that won't hear this podcast because it'll be completely eradicated from all space and time. They'll have no idea how to survive in this new post-cataclysmic world because everything will be forgotten. But if they could just save this episode, this one that you're listening to right now, by sharing,
they can probably stop it all, right?
You could stop it all together. The whole world would be saved.
How we
Thanks to
save
you
the world,
liking,
guys.
sharing, and subscribing Wild and Weird Radio. So until next time, guys,
Do your thing, humans.
stay wild and weird.